So with a blank Touchdesigner open, what we're going to do in this first episode is explore the idea of tops. So I'm going to select everything with my right hand mouse and I'm going to push delete. So I am currently in what is called the Project 1 layer of the default network. If I scroll my mouse too far up, you'll see that I appear to go up a level. And if I scroll down into any of these shapes, I will go down a level. This is one of the main benefits of Touchdesigner and the use of comps, but we'll actually explore that much later in our lessons. For now, I'm just going to scroll inside and make sure I'm inside /project1. And that just means everyone's going to work neatly for us now. Okay, tops. As we mentioned last episode, tops are texture operators. They are ways to add, control, or manipulate or otherwise manipulate textures or images and videos inside Touchdesigner. If I double click anywhere, it'll bring up my operator creation dialog, and I'm going to go to the top menu. I'm going to go to the top tab. Now, this might seem overly daunting to begin with, but there's only so many of the tops you're actually ever going to use, and a lot of them have shared functionality just either in bundled or extracted ways. And thankfully, a lot of them have descriptions on exactly what they do and why they would use them. Normally, if you're trying to achieve a goal, you can have a look at their plain English names and it'll kind of make sense as to what you're trying to do. For example, to get started, I'm going to create some shapes. And to do that, I'm going to add a circle. So when I click it and add it, we can see that it literally creates some circle geometry, a circle texture for us. Now, you can see that it's added this purple operator, purple to match a top. If I added a SOP, we can see that this one comes in blue. So we can really quickly identify our operators in our network. And we can have a quick look at what our operator is able to do. Functionality changes between tops, SOPs, and DATs, etc. But most of our operator viewers, this part here that we're seeing our information in, tends to be the same. In the top left-hand corner, we can enable or disable being able to see it. We have a little zigzag here that allows us to enable or disable whether this top could be what we call cloned by another operator inside a network. It's something that we're not going to cover at all, just because it's so advanced that you'll never come across it. So it doesn't really matter which color your zigzag is for now. We then have something called the bypass, which allows us to temporarily stop an operator from cooking. If I make a quick chain that I don't expect you to understand, so if I insert a circle that goes into a transform and then into a null, and then I transform this over to the right. So I have my circle being created, I'm moving it over to the right using a transform operator, and then it's going into something called a null. If I use the bypass, we can see that this operator stops doing its job, and our circle goes back to being in the center in our final node of the chain. So that's what bypass allows us to do. The lock function allows us to do something very unique inside Touchdesigner. Touchdesigner has an inbuilt file storage system. So if I was to make this circle and know I was happy with it and I didn't want it to change, I could lock this. I could do the same if I brought in a movie file in and locked it. It means that I could now save, transfer this file to someone else's machine, and they would open it, and both of these textures would be locked inside of it, even if that user doesn't have this banana texture or image saved on their machine. If you then release the lock, it means that the image would unlock, or the memory inside Touchdesigner would release, and if I didn't have this image, it would then become blank. So the lock allows us to store textures that source the rest of our pipeline when we're happy with them. We might use this at some point during our lessons, but for now, again, you don't need to worry about it. In the bottom right, if we move down, we can see that our node has a little black dash on either side of it. And these indicate that we are able to input or output data in a pipeline here. And as I did when I input this transform, I'm able to literally drag and drop one node to the other, and they will automatically connect. Only some operators can be connected in certain orders, but for the most part, trial and error will teach you the right way about doing that. For the most part, trial and error will teach you what can and can't be connected together. Moving further down, I have a name bar. This being called circle 1, I can highlight and change to be whatever I want. A name isn't able to support spaces or special characters. They will all become underscores. And finally, over on the right hand side, I have something called the display parameters. For a top, that's a single blue dot. And for something like a chop, it gives us the option of a green and a blue. And for a sop, it gives us green, or it gives us teal, pink, purple, and blue. We don't need to worry about what they do on the more complex ones for now, but if I wanted to visualize what I'm working on, I can use the blue display box to make it full screen in the background of my network. And it just means that I don't need to worry about having a viewer always visible for the work I'm doing. The final is a plus that allows us to what we call activate our viewer. For tops, that's not so important, but again, something we'll pick up when we start using chops and dats much more. When we work inside Touchdesigner, as I explained from the default project, it works in a pull down method. So it goes to the end of a chain and then goes back up its line to see what it needs to do, what processing it needs to do to be able to create the image that we're asking it to. And for that reason, it's always good to use something like a null, whether it be a top null, a chop null, a sop null, or a dat null, to end our chains. It just means that whether we're using a top, a chop, a sop, or a dat, that we have a constant endpoint to all of our pipelines. Whether that be one single chain like we have here, or 10 different strands of data that we're using around our program. Using a null allows us to be more organized, and it also has the added benefit of, if I was, say, viewing this node here, and then I wanted to add something, like my transform again, I'm able to see the update happening if I use something like my null as my display reference. So it's good practice to use a null at the end of your chain, which is just a pure blank container for that type of operator. Okay, with that sort of quick introduction out of the way, we want to explore how do we actually make things using Touchdesigner. So when we're working purely with tops, you need to think of it like a combination between After Effects and Photoshop, all working in real time, all laid out in front of you at once. So if we were to do something as convoluted, if we were to do something as simple as making a smiley face, we want to explore how we could do that while keeping our pipeline as efficient as possible. Remember, the less parts, the more chance we're going to have of keeping that magic 60 frames per second. The more chance we're going to have of keeping that magic 60 frames per second. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my circle top, and I want to make it fill my screen. So I'm going to change my radius to be 0.5 and 0.5. And the important thing to note about that is that all the numbers inside Touchdesigner operator, specifically in tops, are normalized against a UV space, which means on the left hand side here is negative 0.5, and on the right here is 0.5, and the same with the top. Where the bottom is negative 0.5 and the top is 0.5. And the reason that is done is purely to keep consistency between all of the top viewers. It means that no matter the resolutions you're working with, for example, my circle starts at 256 by 256 pixels, it means that 0.5 or the center of 0, 0 always means that it's going to be in the dead center of that viewer window. Inside my circle, I also have control over its rotation, which doesn't really make much sense right now because it's a circle. But if we were to polygonate it, it means that we can change the orientation of our triangle. We have the option to change some colors, whether we want to have things like a background or a border on our circle, as well as multiple tabs at the top. So softness, we can feather out our edge. And then in the common tab, which is consistent among all tops, no matter what it is you bring in, they all have a common tab. The common tab allows us to control the rendering parameters of the object. The first and most common one we would use would be its resolution. So if I have a look, we can see this is quite an aliased circle. If I increase its resolution, suddenly we start to get a sharper edge. Increase its resolution further, and we get an even sharper edge. And that's just pure texture mathematics. So there's only so many pixels this way and only so many pixels that way. If we increase that amount, it means that it can articulate the edge of our sphere over a gentler curve. The downside of that is that increasing the resolution takes more memory, takes more processing time, and can eventually affect our frames per second. When we're working with sort of basic texture level stuff like this, we're never really going to impact our performance at all. It's more just an observation for when we're further down into our Touchdesigner life cycle, so that we're aware of what we're developing and how it's affecting, or how what we're implementing could be affecting our operating speed. Back in the circle tab, I'm not going to change my color because I'm actually going to explore a different way to implement a color change that allows me to use one circle to create an entire smiley face. So like I did in the past, I'm going to implement a null, or like I explained, I'm going to implement a null to be the ender of my chain. And I'm going to turn on its display tab. I'm going to turn on its display parameter so I can see it in the background. And then I want to create a smaller subset circle that I'm going to turn into one of my eyes. So I'm going to insert a transform, and the transform allows me to control things like the scale of my circle. It allows me to do something called, it allows me to translate it, so move it on the X and the Y, and again it allows me to rotate it. When I'm changing the parameters of any of these objects, I'm hovering over the parameter window, and instead of me having to delete and type something, I'm holding the middle mouse button on my mouse wheel, and then I'm pulling the mouse left and right while still holding it. And you can see it gives me this quick access menu to change between tens, ones, point ones, tenths, and hundredths. And it's the only real way that you'll ever change data in Touchdesigner once you've learned how to do it. So again, that's hover over, and you can see I can highlight it, middle mouse held, and then I pull left and right. Okay, so I want to make this an eye. So ideally I would want to shrink it. So I'm going to hold over my scale and scale down to about 0.1. The only problem with doing this is it means that I've lost my original circle from my null. So like we would in Touchdesigner, I'm going to add my layers back together by compositing them on top of each other. Now inside the operator menu there is a composite, but there's also individual compositing methods separated out. For example, if we look at a composite, it has an operation that has like 36 different types. There is also an over, a multiply, an add and an add, for example, as standalone compositing methods. Personally, I prefer to use the comp because it allows us to layer more than 2 items together at once. So with my comp in place, we can see it has an error because there's not enough sources. So I'm going to drag and drop the output from my transform and drag and drop the output from my hello world so that they're in the same space. I want to change my operator type so it's over, so that whatever I plug in on top is over what's plugged in at the bottom. And I know this is working now, we just can't see my circle because it's also white. So I want to implement a change of color for this one. And to do that, I'm going to integrate another texture creator called a constant. So I'm going to bring in a constant, and we can see it's just a solid color of 256 by 256 pixels. I'm going to click this color and change it to be, let's say, black. And now I need to apply this black color over the top of this transform. And to do that, I'm going to do it's a photo editing method called multiplying. So I can use the multiply node, or I can use Composite in multiply method, and they'll both have the same effect. So if I plug them both in here, what this will do is it will multiply any white values by any other values inside of there. So the white value of my circle is multiplied by the value of the black, which means that anything that was white now takes on the value of the black. And we can see that both of them do the exact same thing, it's just the composite gives us much more choice. But now I'm just going to use a multiply. I'm going to drag out from the output of my multiply and hold over the top of my transforms already connected in tether. We can see it turns yellow, and now if I release, it will replace that existing tether in the network. So now I have my black dot on top of my white dot. I'm going to go back to my transform and change my scale down slightly, and I'm also going to translate it a little bit. So I would say that's probably in around the right position. I now want to create a second one. So I'm going to copy and paste both my transform and my multiply. So now I have a duplicate version of my eye that maintains all the parameters and the connections. And I'm going to add this new eye to my composite as well. But we don't see it. And we don't see it because it's layered the wrong way. We are using the over operator, which will literally layer our multiply on top of our hello world, which is our main circle, on top of our multiply 2. That multiply 2 is our second eye that we've just created. So to rearrange it, I'm going to use these up arrows to make sure that hello world is always the bottom layer. And now if I transform my eye over to the right hand side, we can see that we get the effect that we're looking for. I now want to create a mouth, so I'm going to make a new transform. And this one I am going to again multiply a color onto. But this time I'm going to make it, let's say, red. So now with my multiply connected properly, so I've got my color going into the bottom, my circle going into the top, you can now see I have a big red circle. I'm also going to plug that into our composite. I'm going to scale this way down. I'm going to move it down slightly. And you can see that we now have a mouth in place, but it has a terrible aliasing problem on its surface. And the reason for that is because the way that our multiply works is we're giving it two source images and it's creating one. And what it does in this case is it says, okay, which resolution do you want me to use to drive this? And by default, that's set to input 2. Our high resolution image is going into input 1 at the moment. So to solve that, I would either need to reverse my input, so plug that in there and that in there, and we can see that suddenly we get a super crisp circle. The other option I've got is I can change my fix layer. So I can go to input 1 and change its resolution to say pull this from the first image, not from the second image, because my square is only 256, whereas my circle is 1000. And it just means that we can control the flow of resolution as well. Okay, and just like that, I've created a face. If I go back to my start and introduce another constant, I'm going to make this one yellow. We're going to turn this into an emoji. So again, I'm going to add a multiply. I'm going to right click on this main chain that goes from my white circle to the composite. I'm going to insert a multiply, and I'm going to add my constant to that. My resolution is dropped because my constant's in the wrong space. So I'm going to go to input 1, and now I have a shocked faced emoji. All of it done in real time using Touchdesigner's TOPS. Included with this lesson file, you would have received 4 shape images. I'm going to drag and drop them in, and you'll see that Touchdesigner automatically loads and formats our images into movie file ins. Gives them the correct names based on the names of the file. That's an example of how easy it is to get footage or document. That's how easy it is to get files or footage into Touchdesigner. But what I want you to do is I want you to have a go at recreating each of these. So I want you to go through the steps of using the skills we learned here to color, layer, and position shapes correctly so that we can make images like these. One tip I would give you before we start would be this circle pattern has some slight transparency on it. So when you look at something like a constant, it has an alpha level that you can control as well. 1 being 100%, 0 being 0%. All of those circles have an alpha of 0.5. I'll check back in a minute and we'll have a look at how I implemented these solutions, and you can compare them with your answers to see how you got on.